The stars had always seemed quiet to the people of Earth. For centuries, humans looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone was out there. They built telescopes, sent probes, and listened for signals. Most scientists believed that if intelligent life existed, it was too far away to ever matter. They were wrong. Far beyond the edge of the solar system, an old and powerful civilization called the Galactic Empire had been watching Earth for a long time. The Empire ruled over 1,000 different alien worlds. It had existed for tens of thousands of years, growing bigger with every century, by conquering new planets and folding them into its rule. Most species joined willingly, afraid of what would happen if they resisted. Others were crushed quickly, their armies no match for Imperial technology. The Empire had never lost a war, not once. And because of this, its leaders believed no species in the galaxy could ever stand against them. When Imperial scanners first picked up radio waves from Earth, nobody took it seriously. The signals were old, decades old by the time they reached Imperial space, and they showed a species still fighting wars with metal ships and simple bombs. To the Empire, humans looked exactly like every other species before they were conquered, primitive, divided, and unaware of the danger sitting just beyond their sky. An Imperial scout fleet, called the Vorkon Vanguard, was sent to observe this new species up close. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Threxa Voss, a tall, gray-skinned alien with sharp eyes and decades of experience conquering less advanced worlds. Voss had done this many times before. He knew the pattern. Approach quietly, study the target, then reveal Imperial power all at once, so the natives would understand resistance was pointless. It always worked. Species surrendered instead of dying pointlessly. Voss saw this as mercy, not cruelty. He believed the Empire was doing weaker species a favor by giving them the chance to submit before being destroyed. As the Vorkon Vanguard entered the outer edge of the solar system, hiding just past Neptune, Voss expected silence. Instead, his communication officer picked up something strange. A signal. Not random noise, but a clear, structured message, aimed directly at their fleet. The bridge went silent. No cloaking technology in the galaxy should have let a primitive species detect an Imperial fleet from this distance. And yet, here was proof that they had. The message played in the ship's translator, converting the human language into something every alien on board could understand. The voice was calm, almost gentle. It came from someone called the Terran Defense Council, a name none of the Imperial officers recognized. To whoever is listening beyond our system, we know you are here. We have studied your kind long before you noticed us. Humanity has fought many wars among itself, wars that nearly destroyed us more than once. We have learned hard lessons from them. We do not wish for conflict with you. But if you come closer with intentions of conquest, we ask you to reconsider. Turn back now. This is not a threat. It is a warning, given out of respect, not fear. For a moment, nobody on the bridge spoke. Then, laughter broke the silence. Officers chuckled, shaking their heads. To them, this was almost adorable. A species that hadn't even discovered faster-than-light travel was warning the Galactic Empire, a civilization that had conquered 1,000 worlds, to stay away. Voss allowed himself a small smile. They have spirit, he said. Foolish, but spirit. His second-in-command, a sharp-featured alien named Keshtral, shook his head. Foolish is right. No cloaking failure has happened in centuries. How did they detect us? Voss waved a hand. Luck. Old equipment misfiring on their side, perhaps. Or their instruments picked up gravitational disturbances from our engines. It does not matter. We will proceed as planned. The plan was simple. The Empire's approach to first contact rarely changed. Send a small, controlled fleet close enough to be seen. Let the target species panic. Then offer them a choice. Peaceful surrender and a place within the Empire, or resistance and eventual defeat. Almost every species in history chose surrender once they understood the size of the force against them. It saved lives. It saved resources. Voss believed it was the responsible way to expand. He ordered the fleet to move closer, past Neptune, past Uranus, toward the inner planets where Earth orbited quietly around its sun. As they moved, Imperial scholars aboard the flagship studied everything they could find about humanity. Old broadcasts, preserved historical records, fragments of human television and radio that had drifted into space over the decades. What they found was disturbing, even by Imperial standards. Humanity had fought 2 massive wars against itself within a single century, wars that killed tens of millions of people. They had built weapons capable of destroying entire cities in an instant, then built thousands more of these weapons, aiming them at each other for decades, in something historians called a Cold War. They had committed genocides, fought civil wars, and split themselves into hundreds of competing nations, often more suspicious of each other than of any outside threat. To Imperial eyes, this only confirmed what they already believed. Humans were dangerous to themselves, disorganized, and desperately in need of guidance. Some Imperial officials even argued that conquering Earth would be an act of mercy, saving humanity from itself before it could cause any more damage. But not everyone agreed. A young Imperial historian named Dessa Vren, assigned to Voss's fleet as an advisor, raised a concern that few wanted to hear. "Everyone keeps looking at how many times humans went to war," she said during a briefing. "Nobody is asking how they kept surviving it. A species that destructive to itself should have gone extinct centuries ago. Instead, they built more advanced technology after every disaster. They learned. Every single time." Voss dismissed her concerns politely, the way a senior officer dismisses a nervous junior. "Every species has moments of growth after tragedy, Vren. It means nothing. We are not here to admire them. We are here to bring them into the Empire, one way or another." Dessa said nothing more, but she kept reading. She studied the pattern of human history more closely than anyone else on the ship, noticing something that unsettled her. Humans didn't just recover from disasters. They used the memory of disaster as fuel. Every war led to new technology, new alliances, new ways of solving problems that hadn't existed before. It was as if human society treated catastrophe not as an ending, but as a lesson written in blood, one they refused to forget. She tried to bring this up again in a smaller meeting with Voss and a few senior officers, but was quickly waved off. The Empire had encountered dozens of destructive species before. Every one of them eventually surrendered once faced with true, overwhelming power. There was no reason to believe humans would be any different. Meanwhile, back on Earth, humanity was not panicking, though word of the approaching fleet had reached the highest levels of government. In a quiet, heavily guarded facility beneath the Rocky Mountains, the Terran Defense Council gathered for an emergency session. Unlike the divided nations of old, humanity had unified decades earlier, forced together not by war, but by necessity. After global disasters and near catastrophes taught humanity that survival required cooperation, not division. The council's leader, a calm woman named Director Amara Chen, addressed the room. "They didn't listen," she said simply. "We expected that. Now we prepare for the next step." A general at the table frowned. "Are we certain about this approach? A gentle warning first?" They could see it as weakness. Chen shook her head. "It's not weakness, it's honesty. We've spent decades preparing quietly, not to attack anyone, but to protect ourselves, in case this exact moment happened. We gave them a chance to turn away peacefully. History will remember that we tried. And if they don't turn away," Chen's expression didn't change, "then it's already too late for them to complain about what happens next." Far above Earth, hidden systems long buried in the outer solar system began to quietly activate. Systems built not for conquest, but for defense. Designed by generations of scientists who studied humanity's darkest wars and vowed never to be caught unprepared again. Satellites that looked like space debris shifted slightly in their orbits. Old, abandoned-looking probes near Jupiter and Saturn powered on systems that had been dormant for years, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. None of it was visible to the approaching Imperial fleet. Not yet. Admiral Voss continued his advance, confident and unaware, believing he commanded a fleet of unstoppable warships approaching a defenseless, primitive world. He had faced dozens of species before Earth, and all of them had eventually knelt before the Empire's might. He did not yet understand that humanity had never been asking for permission. They had been giving a warning, and the fleet, moving steadily closer toward the blue and green planet at the center of the solar system, was about to learn exactly what that warning meant. 3 days passed after the first warning, measured in Earth time, though for Admiral Voss and his fleet, time moved differently as they crossed the vast emptiness between the outer planets. The Vorkon Vanguard consisted of 12 warships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. Their hulls gleamed with dark metal plating, designed to absorb most forms of energy weapons. Their engines bent space itself to move faster than light should normally allow. To Voss, this fleet represented centuries of Imperial engineering, refined through thousands of successful conquests. As the fleet crossed the orbit of Uranus, Imperial sensors picked up something odd. Faint energy signatures, scattered across the outer solar system, hidden among what looked like ordinary space debris and dead satellites. Kestrel brought this to the Admiral's attention during a routine bridge meeting. "Background radiation, most likely," Voss said, barely glancing at the data. "Or leftover junk from their early space exploration attempts. Humans sent thousands of satellites into orbit before they unified as a species. Most of it is probably still floating out here, forgotten. Vren, still serving as historical advisor, studied the readings more carefully. Something about the pattern didn't sit right with her. The signatures weren't randomly scattered. They were spaced out with a strange, deliberate precision, almost like a net stretched loosely across the outer solar system. She mentioned this to Voss, but he brushed it aside again. You see patterns everywhere, Vren. It is your job as a historian, I understand. But we are not here to study space debris. We are here to bring a message to the humans, and if necessary, remind them why resistance is pointless. The Empire's approach to first contact had a specific structure, one that had worked for thousands of years across countless worlds. First, observe. Second, send a formal warning of Imperial arrival, offering peaceful integration. Third, if the warning is rejected or ignored, demonstrate overwhelming force through a controlled show of power, usually the destruction of an unpopulated area or an old abandoned structure, enough to prove capability without unnecessary bloodshed. This method had ended almost every first contact situation in Imperial history, with peaceful surrender. Voss ordered the fleet to send its official warning to Earth, translated into every major human language his linguists could identify from old broadcasts. The message was formal, direct, and full of Imperial confidence. People of Earth, we are the Galactic Empire, rulers of 1,000 worlds across the stars. We have observed your species and understand your history of conflict and division. We offer you a path to peace and prosperity through membership in our empire. Submit to Imperial authority within one solar cycle, and your world will be protected, your technology advanced, and your people given a place among the stars. Resist, and you will face consequences you cannot begin to understand. This is your only warning. The message was sent, bouncing across radio frequencies toward Earth. Imperial officers waited, expecting either silence or a desperate plea for mercy. The two most common the two most common reactions from primitive species throughout history. Instead, Earth replied within hours, not with panic, not with pleading. The response was short, translated instantly by the ship's systems into every alien language aboard. We warned you. Voss stared at the message for a long moment. Around him, several officers exchanged confused glances. Kestrel broke the silence first. That's it? No demands? No surrender terms? No plea for their lives? Voss frowned, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his command chair. It could be a translation error, or perhaps a defiant gesture meant to save face before their inevitable surrender. Species do strange things when they are frightened. Vren, however, felt a chill she couldn't quite explain. She had spent weeks studying human history, and something about this reply matched a pattern she had noticed before. Humans didn't respond to threats with panic. They responded with quiet, calculated resolve, especially when they believed they had already prepared for the worst. She thought of the world wars she had studied, how humanity had rebuilt itself again and again, each time emerging more advanced, more unified, more prepared for the next disaster. She raised her concern once more during the evening briefing. Admiral, I don't think this is defiance for the sake of pride. Their historical pattern shows something different. When humans believe a threat is real and unavoidable, they don't panic. They prepare, quietly, long before the threat arrives. I think this message means exactly what it says. They warned us, and they believe the warning still stands, regardless of what we do next. Voss considered her words for a moment, then shook his head. Vren, I respect your research, but you are reading too much into a single phrase. No species without faster-than-light travel has ever successfully resisted Imperial conquest. Not once, in the entire history of the Empire. Whatever they believe they have prepared, it will not be enough. The fleet continued its approach, crossing into the region of space near Saturn. As they moved, more strange energy signatures appeared on their sensors, scattered like stars across the outer solar system, this time closer and slightly stronger than before. Kestrel, growing increasingly uneasy, ordered a closer sensor sweep. The results were confusing. Most of the objects still appeared to be simple debris, old satellites, and abandoned equipment, exactly what Voss had predicted. But a small number, less than 1% of the total objects detected, showed unusual energy readings that didn't match anything in the Empire's records. Not weapon signatures, not shield technology, something else entirely, something that defied easy classification. Voss ordered a probe sent to investigate one of the stranger objects, a satellite drifting quietly near Saturn's outer rings. The probe approached carefully, scanning the object from a safe distance. It appeared to be old and non-functional, covered in what looked like decades of space dust and micro-impacts. No response came from the object as the probe circled it, taking readings. Then, without warning, the probe's sensors went dark. Communication with the fleet cut off instantly, as if something had reached out and silenced it in a single moment. Kestrel called for the probe to respond. Nothing. The screen simply displayed static, then silence. The bridge went quiet. Voss ordered a second probe sent to the same location. This one approached even more cautiously, scanning from twice the distance. As it neared the object, its sensors also began flickering, distorted by some kind of interference the Empire's systems couldn't identify or counter. "Recall it," Voss ordered sharply. The probe reversed course immediately, and its system stabilized once it moved far enough away. Vren stepped forward. "Admiral, I think it's time we consider that these aren't ordinary satellites. If humanity built defensive systems disguised as space debris, systems designed specifically to interfere with unfamiliar technology, it would explain everything. The scattered pattern, the strange energy readings, even how they detected our fleet in the first place." Voss's expression hardened. For the first time since entering the solar system, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But he quickly dismissed it, unwilling to let uncertainty shake his confidence in front of his crew. "Even if you are correct, Vren, disguised defenses do not win wars. They delay them. The Empire has encountered hidden defenses before, on a dozen different worlds. They inconvenience us. They do not stop us." He ordered the fleet to adjust its course slightly, avoiding the cluster of strange objects near Saturn, continuing steadily toward Earth. The delay cost them little time, and Voss reassured his officers that this was simply an expected obstacle, nothing more than a minor technological curiosity from a primitive species trying to appear more capable than it truly was. Meanwhile, on Earth, Director Amara Chen received updates from the outer solar system relayed through humanity's carefully hidden monitoring network. She studied the reports quietly in the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by advisors and military officials. They avoided the first cluster, a young analyst reported, watching the fleet's projected path shift slightly on the display. "They're being cautious now." Chen nodded slowly. "Cautious, but still coming. They still believe this ends the same way it always has for them." An older general beside her frowned. "Should we send a stronger message? Make it clear how serious this is?" Chen shook her head. "We already told them the truth. We warned them clearly, honestly, without threats or exaggeration. If they choose not to believe us, that is their decision, not our failure. We will not beg a fleet of invaders to save themselves from consequences they refuse to acknowledge." The room fell silent for a moment, as everyone absorbed the weight of her words. Then Chen added quietly, almost to herself, "They still think this is about proving strength. They don't understand yet. This was never a contest of strength. It's a matter of choice, and they've made theirs." Far above, the Imperial fleet continued its approach, drawing closer to Earth with each passing hour, unaware that the true nature of humanity's warning was about to become impossible to ignore. By the time the Vorkon vanguard crossed the orbit of Mars, Admiral Voss had grown quietly frustrated. Every hour brought new sensor readings from the strange objects scattered throughout the solar system, and every hour, his officers found fewer answers and more questions. The fleet had rerouted twice more to avoid clusters of the disguised satellites, and each detour cost precious time. Still, Voss refused to see this as anything more than a minor inconvenience caused by a species desperate to appear more advanced than it truly was. Kestrel, however, had grown increasingly cautious. He requested a full tactical review before the fleet moved any closer to Earth. Voss allowed it, mostly to quiet the growing unease spreading through his officers. The review revealed something troubling. Imperial engineers, studying the failed probes sent toward the mysterious satellites, discovered that the interference wasn't random. It followed a careful, structured pattern, as if something intelligent was actively responding to their scans, learning from each attempt, adjusting in real time. This wasn't old, forgotten technology drifting uselessly in space. It was active. It was watching them. Vren, called in to review the findings alongside the engineers, felt a growing sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She thought back to everything she had read about humanity's history. Every disaster, every war, every near collapse had been followed by decades of quiet, determined rebuilding. Humans didn't panic when threatened. They prepared. And if this pattern held true even now, then the strange objects surrounding the solar system weren't just simple defenses. They were part of something much larger. Something built over decades in complete secrecy. Waiting patiently for a moment, exactly like this one, she brought her concerns to Voss one final time, standing firm despite his previous dismissals. "Admiral, I believe we are no longer approaching a defenseless world. I believe we already crossed into contact with an active defensive network, one specifically designed to study and adapt to unfamiliar technology. Every probe we've lost hasn't been destroyed. It's been studied." Voss considered her words carefully this time, his earlier confidence slightly shaken by the mounting evidence. But before he could respond, alarms suddenly blared across the bridge. Every screen on the flagship flickered simultaneously. Communication arrays across the entire fleet went silent all at once, cutting off contact between ships that had been coordinating perfectly just moments before. Navigation systems froze, locked in place by something neither Voss nor his engineers could identify or override. The Vorkon vanguard had crossed into the outer edge of the Kuiper Belt, a region humanity had spent decades quietly filling with hidden defensive technology, disguised so perfectly as debris and dead satellites that even advanced Imperial sensors failed to recognize its true purpose until it was already too late. Voss ordered immediate countermeasures, but nothing responded. His ship, along with the rest of the fleet, drifted silently, cut off from Imperial command, from each other, and from the rest of the galaxy. It wasn't destruction. It wasn't an attack in the traditional sense. It was isolation, precise and complete, leaving thousands of Imperial soldiers stranded in silence, unable to call for help or coordinate a response. For the first time in his long career, Admiral Voss felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Fear. Kestrel worked desperately alongside the engineering teams, trying to restore even partial communication between ships. Hours passed with no success. The silence stretched on, broken only by the quiet hum of life support systems still functioning normally, a small mercy that offered no real comfort given the fleet's helpless situation. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something far more concerning to Imperial officials scattered across the wider galaxy. Earth's message, the one dismissed so easily weeks earlier, had not stayed confined to a simple exchange between Earth and a single scout fleet. Using methods the Empire still didn't fully understand, humanity had managed to broadcast their warning across a much wider network, one that reached far beyond the solar system, touching Imperial communication channels used by client species throughout the galaxy. Billions of beings across 1,000 worlds suddenly found strange transmissions appearing on their networks, footage of humanity's darkest historical moments, followed immediately by footage of what humanity had built afterward. World wars followed by global cooperation, nuclear standoffs followed by unified scientific advancement, genocide followed by generations dedicated to preventing such horrors from ever happening again. The message wasn't subtle. It showed a species that had faced its own worst nature and had chosen, again and again, to become something better. Attached to this historical record was a simple, direct statement, translated into hundreds of different languages spoken across the Empire's client worlds. "We are not perfect. We have made terrible mistakes, but we learned from every one of them. We do not wish to conquer anyone. We only wish to be left in peace." If an empire built on conquest cannot understand this, perhaps it is not humanity that needs saving. For the first time in centuries, doubt began spreading through worlds that had lived under Imperial rule for generations. Client species, many of whom had been conquered decades or centuries earlier and forced into obedience, began quietly discussing what they had just seen. If humanity, a species with such a violent history, could still find a way toward peace and unity, without an empire forcing them into submission, what did that say about the Empire's justification for ruling over so many unwilling worlds? Imperial officials scrambled to control the spread of the message, blocking channels and issuing statements dismissing it as primitive propaganda. But the message had already done its damage. Seeds of doubt, quiet and dangerous, had been planted across 1,000 worlds that had never questioned Imperial rule before. Back in the solar system, Admiral Voss remained trapped in silence, his fleet drifting powerlessly through space. After nearly 2 full days without contact, a single transmission broke through the interference, reaching his flagship directly. It wasn't from Imperial command, it was from Earth. The voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably human. It came from Director Amara Chen herself, speaking directly to the stranded fleet for the first time. "Admiral Voss, we understand you can hear this message, even if you cannot respond. We did not disable your fleet to destroy you. We disabled it to make you listen. You crossed into our system, despite multiple warnings given honestly, without exaggeration or threat. We told you this would happen. We are not your enemy unless you force us to become one." Voss listened in stunned silence, surrounded by officers who had never imagined finding themselves in a position of such complete helplessness against a species they had considered primitive just days earlier. Chen's voice continued, steady and unwavering. You believed our warning was weakness. It was not. It was respect, offered once, honestly, before consequences became unavoidable. We do not enjoy this situation any more than you do, but we will not apologize for protecting what is ours. The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, leaving the bridge in heavy silence. Voss finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been in days. Draal, status of the fleet. Kesh Draal checked the reports again, his expression grim. All ships remain intact. Life support functioning. Weapons systems offline. Navigation locked. We are completely at their mercy, Admiral. Voss sat back in his chair, staring at the dark screen where Chen's message had played moments earlier. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully consider what Desavren had been trying to tell him from the very beginning. This had never been a primitive species bluffing about power they didn't have. It had been an honest, calculated warning from a species that understood exactly what it was capable of, and exactly what it would take to prove that capability if necessary. Dessa approached quietly, standing beside the Admiral's chair. They didn't destroy us, Admiral. They could have. Every ship in this fleet was completely vulnerable the moment our systems went dark. Instead, they chose to talk. Voss nodded slowly, understanding settling over him with the weight of a decision he now had no choice but to make. Because they aren't interested in destruction, Vren. They're interested in being left alone, and we crossed a line no one warned us not to cross, except they did warn us. Twice. Far beyond the fleet's isolated position, similar situations were unfolding elsewhere. Reports trickled in slowly through backup channels that still functioned, revealing that Imperial monitoring stations throughout the galaxy had noticed unusual activity among client species. Small acts of resistance, quiet refusals to follow Imperial orders, whispered conversations about the message from Earth, spreading from world to world despite the Empire's efforts to suppress it. For the first time since the Empire's founding, cracks were beginning to show in a structure that had stood unchallenged for tens of thousands of years. Cracks caused not by military defeat, but by a simple, honest message from a species the Empire had once dismissed as too weak to matter. Voss finally issued an order he never imagined giving in his long career. Open every channel we still have access to. Send a formal request for parley directly to Earth's leadership. It's time we listened to them, instead of the other way around. As the request was sent, drifting quietly through space toward a planet that had tried to warn them from the very beginning, Admiral Voss couldn't shake a single realization settling heavily over him. The Empire had spent so long assuming humanity's warning was empty, they had failed to notice it was already far too late to matter. The request for parley reached Earth within minutes, relayed through the same channels Director Chen had used to contact the stranded fleet. In the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, the Terran Defense Council gathered once again, reviewing the Imperial message with careful attention. Admiral Voss's request was formal, almost stiff, clearly written by someone unaccustomed to asking for anything from a species he had considered beneath him just days earlier. It requested a meeting between Imperial and Terran representatives to discuss the situation and find a peaceful resolution. Director Chen read the message twice before setting it down. "They want to talk now," she said quietly. Interesting how quickly priorities change once the ships stop working. A younger council member, a strategist named Marcus Webb, leaned forward. "Should we accept? This could be a genuine attempt at peace, or it could be a delay tactic while they wait for reinforcements." Chen considered this for a moment. Either way, refusing to talk serves no purpose. We built our entire response around one principle: warn honestly, act decisively, but never seek unnecessary conflict. If they want to talk, we listen, but we do so from a position we've already secured, not one we're hoping to protect. The Council agreed to the parley, setting conditions that made their position clear from the start. The meeting would take place through secure communication only. No physical meeting between fleets or representatives. Earth had no interest in exposing any additional information about its capabilities, beyond what the Empire had already discovered on its own. Meanwhile, aboard the flagship, Admiral Voss prepared for the conversation, with a mixture of professional discipline and quiet dread. He had spent his entire career representing Imperial strength and authority. Now, for the first time, he would be negotiating from a position of weakness, representing a fleet completely at the mercy of the very species he had been sent to conquer. Desavren stood beside him as the connection was established, her earlier warnings now impossible to ignore. "Admiral, if I may offer one piece of advice before this begins." Voss nodded, gesturing for her to continue. "Don't approach this as a defeated commander seeking mercy. And don't approach it as an Imperial official demanding respect you haven't earned. Approach it honestly, the same way they've approached us from the very beginning. I believe that's the only way this conversation succeeds." Voss considered her words carefully, then nodded once more before the connection opened. Director Chen appeared on the screen, calm and composed, exactly as she had sounded during her previous message. Beside her stood General Okonkwo Reyes, the Council's senior military advisor, along with two other officials Voss didn't recognize. "Admiral Voss," Chen said simply, "you requested this conversation. I'm listening." Voss straightened in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Director Chen, my fleet remains stranded within your solar system, without weapons, navigation, or communication with Imperial Command. I am prepared to discuss terms for our safe departure, as well as terms for future relations between our peoples." Chen's expression remained neutral. "Before we discuss terms, Admiral, I think it's important to address something directly. You approached our system with the clear intention of conquest, despite two separate warnings asking you to reconsider. Do you understand why that approach failed?" Voss hesitated, glancing briefly at Dessa before answering honestly. "Because we assumed your species lacked the capability to resist meaningfully. We were wrong." "It's not just about capability, Admiral," Chen replied. "We could have destroyed your fleet the moment it entered our system. We chose not to, because destruction was never our goal. Our goal was survival, and if possible, peace. You didn't fail because we outmatched you in power. You failed because you assumed intentions you never bothered to ask about." The words settled heavily over the connection, and for a long moment, neither side spoke. Voss finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. "Then tell me, Director, what do you want from us?" Chen answered without hesitation. "The same thing we asked for from the very beginning, to be left alone. We have no interest in conquering other worlds, no desire to expand beyond our own system unless threatened. We are not interested in ruling over anyone. We only want the freedom to continue building our own future, without outside forces deciding that future for us." General Reyes added, "Your fleet will be released once we've confirmed there's no immediate threat to our system. We're not interested in holding your people prisoner, or using this situation to demand unreasonable concessions, but we do expect a clear, formal acknowledgement that Earth is not, and will not become, a territory of the Galactic Empire." Voss glanced toward Dessa again, who gave a small, encouraging nod. He turned back to the screen. "I am prepared to recommend exactly those terms to Imperial Command, along with a full report detailing the reasons for our failure here. I believe, given what has already spread across Imperial networks regarding your history and intentions, there may be little appetite among the wider Empire to pursue further conflict with Earth." Chen's expression softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "Then we have a foundation to build from, Admiral." As the negotiations continued, similar conversations were unfolding across dozens of other Imperial worlds, though not with such calm diplomacy. Earth's broadcast, still spreading steadily despite Imperial efforts to suppress it, had done more damage to the Empire's authority than any single military defeat could have. Client species who had lived under Imperial rule for generations, species who had long ago given up hope of independence, found themselves quietly inspired by humanity's example. On a distant world called Thren, home to a peaceful aquatic species, who had been forced into Imperial servitude nearly 3 centuries earlier, local leaders organized their first open act of resistance in generations, a simple refusal to supply Imperial forces with resources demanded for the ongoing pacification of Earth. Small, quiet acts like this began appearing across multiple systems, each one inspired by the same message. A species facing overwhelming odds had chosen honesty and preparation over submission, and it had worked. Imperial High Command, based on the capital world of Corveth Prime, found itself facing a crisis far larger than a single stranded fleet. Emperor Talvros Ren, ruler of the Thousand World Empire, called an emergency session with his highest advisors, demanding answers for how a single, isolated conflict with an unremarkable species had spiraled into growing unrest across multiple client worlds. "This is unacceptable," Ren said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of unchallenged authority. "A single scout fleet, stranded by a primitive species, and suddenly our client worlds forget 300 years of loyal service." One of his advisors, a cautious diplomat named Sela Vantrix, stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty, it's not simply about the fleet. It's about what the message revealed. Our client worlds have always been told that resistance against the Empire is pointless, that submission is the only path to survival and prosperity. Earth's message challenged that belief directly, showing a species that faced its own destruction repeatedly, yet found a way to grow strong without an Empire's guidance." Ren's expression darkened. "Then we destroy the message. Cut off every channel it spreads through. Silence this Earth entirely, if that's what it takes to end this unrest." Vantrix hesitated before responding, choosing her next words with extreme care. "Your Majesty, Our fleet is currently stranded within their system, completely at their mercy. If we escalate this situation now, threatening the total destruction of their species, and it fails, the damage to Imperial authority would be far worse than anything we've experienced so far. We would be proving Earth's message correct with our own actions. The room fell silent, the weight of the situation settling over even the most confident advisors. Ren sat quietly for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice noticeably calmer, though still filled with barely restrained frustration. Then what do you suggest? Vantrix took a careful breath. I suggest we accept Admiral Voss's negotiated terms. Withdraw our forces from their system, formally recognize their independence, and quietly manage the unrest among our client worlds through more traditional methods, before this spreads any further. Ren considered this option for a long moment, clearly disliking every part of it, before finally nodding once. Fine, withdraw the fleet, but make it clear this decision comes from strategic patience, not weakness. I will not have this recorded as an Imperial retreat. Back within the solar system, negotiations between Admiral Voss and Director Chen concluded successfully, after several more hours of careful discussion. Earth agreed to release the stranded fleet's navigation and communication systems, allowing safe passage back toward Imperial space, in exchange for a formal, signed acknowledgement recognizing Earth's independence and sovereignty, free from any future claims of Imperial authority. As the fleet system slowly came back online, Voss took a moment to review the final agreement one last time, before signing it officially. Dessa Vren stood quietly beside him, watching the process with a mixture of relief and quiet vindication. You were right from the beginning, Voss admitted quietly, not looking up from the documents in front of him. I should have listened sooner. Dessa offered a small, understanding smile. It's not about being right, Admiral. It's about understanding who you're dealing with before deciding how to approach them. We assumed we understood humanity, based on their past. We never considered what they might have built because of it. As the Vorkon Vanguard slowly regained full control of its systems, preparing for the long journey back to Imperial space, Admiral Voss allowed himself one final look at the distant blue and green planet visible through the viewport. A planet he had once viewed as an easy conquest, now understood as something far more complicated, and far more dangerous to underestimate than anyone in the Empire had ever imagined. 6 months passed after the Vorkon Vanguard limped back into Imperial space, carrying with it a formal treaty recognizing Earth's independence. For Admiral Voss, those 6 months felt longer than his entire career combined. He had expected disgrace upon his return, perhaps even removal from command. Instead, Emperor Talvros Ren received him with a strange, careful courtesy, more interested in understanding what had happened than punishing the officer who had failed to conquer a single, unremarkable world. The treaty itself became public knowledge across the Empire almost immediately, despite efforts by Imperial officials to control the narrative. Client worlds that had spent generations under Imperial rule now had documented proof that resistance wasn't always pointless, that a species facing overwhelming force could still choose the terms of its own survival, if it prepared honestly and refused to be intimidated into premature surrender. The unrest that began quietly on worlds like Thren didn't fade away as Imperial officials had hoped. Instead, it grew steadily, spreading from one client world to another, each act of resistance inspired by the memory of Earth's calm, unwavering warning against an empire that had assumed conquest was inevitable. Small refusals became larger protests. Larger protests became formal demands for renegotiated terms of Imperial rule. Some worlds, emboldened by the example Earth had set, began drafting their own declarations of independence, citing the treaty between Earth and the Empire as precedent. Emperor Ren found himself facing a crisis unlike anything the Empire had encountered in its long history. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a rebellion in the traditional sense. It was something far more difficult to control: doubt, spreading quietly across 1,000 worlds that had never before questioned whether Imperial rule was truly necessary for their survival. Sela Vantrix, the cautious diplomat who had advised accepting Earth's terms, found herself promoted to a more prominent role within Imperial leadership, tasked specifically with managing relations with increasingly restless client worlds. She approached her new position with the same careful reasoning that had guided her advice regarding Earth. We cannot rule through fear alone anymore, she explained, during a council session several months after the treaty's signing. Earth proved that fear only works as long as no one questions it. Once that question exists, once even a single world successfully resists, the entire foundation becomes unstable. Ren, though still uncomfortable with how the situation had unfolded, recognized the wisdom in her words. Slowly, cautiously, the Empire began shifting its approach toward client worlds, offering slightly better terms, slightly more autonomy, hoping to prevent further unrest before it spiraled completely out of control. It wasn't the collapse of the Empire, not yet, but it marked the beginning of a slow, undeniable shift in how the Empire understood its own power. Meanwhile, on Earth, life continued much as it had before the arrival of the Vorkon vanguard, though humanity now carried a new understanding of its place in the galaxy. Director Amara Chen addressed the Terran Defense Council one final time regarding the incident, summarizing what the experience had taught them. "We built our defenses not because we wanted conflict," she said, standing before the assembled council members, "but because we understood that peace without preparation is simply an invitation for those who don't respect boundaries. We warned the Empire honestly, without exaggeration, and we backed that warning with quiet, careful preparation, built over decades, hoping we would never need to use it." She paused, looking around the room at faces that had guided humanity through this uncertain moment in its history. "We didn't seek to conquer, or to prove our strength for its own sake. We only wanted to protect what we built after centuries of hard, painful lessons. That is what this was always about." The message humanity had sent across Imperial networks continued circulating for years afterward, becoming something of a quiet legend among species who had lived under Imperial rule for generations. Some client worlds began referring to it simply as the warning, a symbol of hope for anyone who believed their circumstances were unchangeable. Scholars across multiple species began studying Earth's history and methods, curious how a species so violent in its past had managed to build something so disciplined and unified in its response to external threats. Dessa Vren, the young historian who had first recognized the danger Earth represented, eventually left her position within Imperial military service, choosing instead to dedicate her career to studying human history and philosophy more deeply. She successfully petitioned for permission to travel to Earth herself, becoming one of the first Imperial citizens allowed to visit the planet under the terms of the new treaty between their peoples. She arrived on Earth nearly a year after the incident, greeted not with hostility, but with polite curiosity, from a species eager to understand more about the wider galaxy they had so narrowly avoided being pulled into by force. She met briefly with Director Chen during her visit, the two women sharing a quiet conversation about everything that had happened. "I still don't fully understand," Dessa admitted during their meeting, "how your species prepared so thoroughly for a threat you couldn't have known was coming." Chen smiled slightly, considering the question carefully before answering. "We didn't know exactly what threat would come. But we understood, after everything we'd been through, that eventually something would challenge us, whether from within our own species or from somewhere beyond it. We simply chose to be ready, rather than hope we never needed to be." Dessa nodded slowly, finally understanding the deeper lesson behind everything she had witnessed. It wasn't about predicting the future perfectly. It was about respecting the lessons of the past, enough to prepare seriously for whatever came next, rather than assuming safety was guaranteed simply because disaster hadn't struck yet. Admiral Voss, meanwhile, found himself in an unusual position within the Empire. Rather than fading into disgrace, his experience became valuable to Imperial leadership, attempting to navigate this new, uncertain relationship with client worlds and outside species. He was tasked with advising future first contact missions, ensuring that no other Imperial commander approached a new species with the same careless assumptions that had led to his failure at Earth. During one such briefing, addressing a group of younger officers preparing for a mission to a newly discovered species several systems away, Voss offered advice drawn directly from his experience. "Do not assume weakness simply because a species lacks the technology you possess," he told them. "Strength comes in many forms, not just weapons and ships. Some of the most dangerous opponents you will ever encounter won't be the ones who threaten you loudly. They'll be the ones who warn you calmly, then quietly prepare for exactly the moment you choose to ignore them." The officers listened carefully, understanding that this lesson came not from Imperial pride, but from genuine, hard-earned humility. As for Earth, humanity continued advancing steadily, no longer isolated from the wider galaxy, but not eager to expand beyond its own solar system either. Contact between Earth and other species increased slowly over the following years, cautious and measured, built on the same principle that had guided humanity's response to the Empire from the very beginning: honesty, careful preparation, and respect for boundaries, both their own and others. Client worlds that had once lived entirely under Imperial control began forming quiet alliances with each other, inspired by Earth's example, seeking greater independence through unity, rather than open rebellion. The Empire, recognizing the shifting tide, gradually adjusted its approach, understanding that outright conquest was no longer the guaranteed path to expansion it had once been. Years later, historians across multiple species would study this period as a turning point, not just for Earth, but for the Empire itself. It wasn't remembered as a great war, or a dramatic battle between two powerful forces. It was remembered as a moment when a single, honest warning, backed by decades of quiet preparation, changed the balance of power across an entire galaxy, not through destruction, but through the simple, undeniable truth that some species were finally ready to stop being underestimated. Director Amara Chen, in her later years, reflected on the events during a rare public address, her words eventually becoming part of Earth's own historical record, studied by generations of humans who followed. "We never wanted to be the villains of this story," she said. "We only wanted to be the ones who learned enough from our past to protect our future, without needing anyone else's permission to do so. If that lesson reached beyond our own world, if it gave others the courage to expect better for themselves, then perhaps our long, difficult history finally served a purpose beyond our own survival." The stars, once quiet and distant to humanity, no longer seemed so empty or so far away. Earth had sent its warning honestly, prepared for it seriously, and in doing so, had changed not just its own future, but the future of countless worlds who finally understood that even the smallest, most unlikely species could hold the line against an empire, if it simply refused to be caught unprepared. And across the galaxy, in quiet corners of client worlds still living under imperial rule, a simple message continued to spread, carried not by force, but by hope, that no matter how powerful an empire seemed, it was never truly too late to say, clearly and honestly, that enough was enough.